The day Mara Quinn understood what was really happening to Blackstone Ridge, she was standing in the mud outside the county records office with a stack of papers pressed against her chest and a man she'd never seen before blocking her path. He was well dressed for that kind of town: wool coat, clean boots, a hat that hadn't seen rain. He looked at her the way men like him always did, like she was something he'd nearly stepped in. "Those aren't your documents," he said. "They're public records," Mara told him. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Public records have a way of disappearing when the wrong people start asking the wrong questions. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the tobacco on him. "You've got a nice little life here, widow's daughter. Small, manageable. I'd hate to see something happen to it." Then he walked away. No threats, no raised voice, just that smile and those words hanging in the cold air like smoke after a fire. Mara stood there in the mud, heart slamming against her ribs, and thought, "He knows what I found." If that was you, if a stranger had just told you, without saying a single illegal thing, that your life could be made very small very fast, what would you do? Would you put the papers back? Would you walk away? Mara Quinn didn't walk away. That decision was about to change everything. If you're watching this and you've ever been told to stay in your place, stay with us. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The scarf had taken her 11 days. Mara wasn't someone who kept track of time by the calendar. She kept track by work, by how many seams she'd finished, how many pairs of trousers she'd let out at the waist, how many children's dresses she'd hemmed while their mothers stood in her doorway talking about everything except what they actually needed. 11 days of evenings, her hands aching by the end of each one, working the dark wool her father had traded for before he got sick. She'd been saving it for something. She hadn't known what until she figured it out. It was a thank you. That was all it was supposed to be. 3 weeks earlier, one of Ethan Crowe's ranch hands, a quiet man named Doss who had a bad leg and never seemed to talk to anyone, had pulled her wagon out of the ditch on the south road when the wheel had broken through a patch of soft ground. He hadn't asked for anything, hadn't even said much, just hooked his horse to hers, heaved the thing free, checked the wheel, and touched the brim of his hat when she thanked him. She'd asked his name, and he'd told her, and when she asked who he worked for, he'd said Crowe Ranch like it was something he was neither proud nor ashamed of. She'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. Doss didn't need money, not from her anyway, but a good wool scarf in November in Blackstone Ridge was worth something real. She walked up to the main entrance of Crowe Ranch on a Tuesday morning when she knew the hands would be coming in for the midday break. She'd never been inside the fence before. The place was bigger up close than it looked from the road. 3 outbuildings, a long bunkhouse, a barn that could have held her entire shack twice over with room to spare. The yard was churned mud and boot prints and the smell of horses and hay and the particular cold sweat smell of working men in winter clothing. She'd asked for Doss. A boy of about 16 had disappeared into the bunkhouse and come back with the man himself, who looked confused to see her and then more confused when she held out the scarf. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to," she said. "It's November. You could use it." He looked at it for a moment like he wasn't sure how to hold a thing that had been made specifically for him, then wrapped it around his neck once. It fit. She'd guessed right on the length. She'd been about to leave when the other voice came from behind her. "Doss." It was a statement, not a question, and it carried the particular weight of someone who was used to being heard without raising his volume. "Who's this?" She turned around. Ethan Crowe was not what she'd expected, and she wasn't sure afterward what she had expected. He was taller than she'd thought, looking at him from a distance across churchyards or on the far side of the street, somewhere in his mid-40s with the kind of face that had been exposed to weather for a long time. Not rough exactly, but settled, like stone that had been worn smooth. He was looking at her with no particular expression, which was almost more disconcerting than contempt would have been. Doss explained. He was economical about it, which she appreciated. Crowe looked at the scarf, then at her. "That's good wool," he said. "My father traded for it," she said, "a while back." "Quinn," he said. "You're George Quinn's daughter." "I was," she said. "He's been gone 4 years." Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, just acknowledgement. "I'm sorry about your father. I was a straight dealer." It was a strange thing to say, but she understood what he meant. In Blackstone Ridge, being called a straight dealer was about the highest compliment a man could get because there weren't that many of them. She thanked him and left. She didn't think about it again for 2 days. Then she heard what people in town were saying about it. It started at Calloway's Dry Goods, which was where most things in Blackstone Ridge started. She'd gone in for thread and a tin of lamp oil and had become aware, somewhere between the shelves, that the 2 women at the counter, Louise Hargrave and her daughter-in-law, whose name Mara could never remember, had stopped talking in a way that meant they'd been talking about something they didn't want her to hear. She bought her thread. She bought her oil. She was almost to the door when Louise said pleasantly, "You know, Mara, not every man who's polite to you is interested in being helped by you." She stopped. She turned around slowly. "I left a scarf for a ranch hand who helped me," she said, "as a thank you." "Of course," Louise said. Her tone was a closed door. "We all know that's what it was." The implication was clear enough. She was a poor widow's daughter who had walked onto Ethan Crowe's property and made herself visible, and the town had decided what that meant before she'd even gotten home. It didn't matter that the scarf had gone to Doss. The fact that Crowe had spoken to her, that was the detail that had traveled. That was the one they were working with. She walked back to her shack and sat at her work table for a while without sewing anything. She was 31 years old. She had a one-room shack on a strip of land that was technically hers, though the taxes on it ate up more of her income than she liked to count. She had a sewing basket, a work table, a cast-iron stove, and 3 shelves of books her father had left behind, including 2 full years of county land records he'd been keeping notes in the margins of before his hands got too bad to hold a pen. She'd started reading those records the winter after he died, partly because she had nothing else to do on the long evenings, and partly because it had felt like spending time with him. George Quinn had been meticulous. Every entry had a date, a name, a parcel number, a note. Some of the notes were dry and factual. Others were questions, little puzzles he'd been turning over. Why would Harlan sell the East Pasture at this price when the water access makes it worth double? Who is purchasing on behalf of? She'd been reading those notes for 4 years, and somewhere in the second year, she'd stopped thinking of it as remembering her father and started thinking of it as work. The pattern had taken shape slowly. That was the thing about it. It wasn't obvious. If it had been obvious, someone would have noticed before her. Or maybe they had noticed and hadn't said anything, which was a different problem entirely. It had started with water. Blackstone Ridge sat in a valley, and the valley had been, historically, well watered. Her father's notes went back far enough that she could read his descriptions of the basin in its better years. Springs that ran clear into June, grass that stayed green well into August, ranches that could carry twice the cattle they carried now. The drought that had been grinding the valley down for the past decade was real. She wasn't disputing that. But her father's notes had made her curious about when it had started and how fast. She'd gone to the county surveyor's records. She'd read 12 years of rainfall logs. She'd compared them against the water output records from the 3 main springs that fed the valley, which were a matter of public record because they crossed property lines and therefore had to be registered. The rainfall numbers were low but not catastrophic, not low enough to explain what had happened to the springs. She'd sat with that fact for a long time. Then she'd started looking at land transfers. The pattern was this: a parcel would struggle, visible signs of financial distress, a missed tax payment, a lien filed, and within 6 to 8 months, a company called Meridian Trust would acquire it at a price that was technically legal but deeply low. The same company, again and again, going back 9 years. She'd counted 14 separate acquisitions. Most of them were water-adjacent, creek beds, spring parcels, riparian rights that looked worthless on their own, but added up to something significant if you held them all together. The man who'd stopped her outside the records office, she didn't know his name. She'd gone back the next morning anyway. The clerk, a young man named Potts, who had the nervous energy of someone who had already been told things he wished he didn't know, had met her at the door. "The records you were looking at yesterday," he said. "They've been requested for review. I can't let you copy them right now." "Requested by who?" He looked past her shoulder. "I'm not able to say." She already had copies. She'd been making them by hand for 6 months, writing out the key entries in the notebook she kept under her work table. She thanked Potts and left and walked the long way home, the same route she always took when she needed to think. She hadn't intended to go to Ethan Crowe. The thought hadn't even been fully formed when she found herself at his fence again, 4 days after the records office, on a morning when the cold had a real edge to it and her breath came out in visible clouds. She had the notebook with her. She'd been up half the night going back through it, cross-referencing, second-guessing herself, looking for the explanation that would make it all innocent. She hadn't found one. The gate hand let her through when she asked for Crowe directly. That surprised her. She'd expected to be turned away. Crowe was in the barn when she found him, doing something with the length of harness that he didn't stop doing when she walked in. He looked at her, then at the notebook under her arm. "Miss Quinn," he said. "I need to show you something," she said, "and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong, because if I'm right, you're in more trouble than you know, and so is everyone else in this valley." He set the harness down. He looked at her for a long moment, not suspicious, not amused, something more careful than either. "All right," he said. She opened the notebook. It took her an hour to walk him through it. She was used to explaining things clearly. Her father had been a patient teacher, and she'd learned from him how to lay out evidence in an order that made sense. Crowe listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical and pointed, and when she answered them, he went quiet for a while. 14 parcels, he said finally. "That I can document," she said. "There may be more that I haven't found yet." "And the spring output?" "Dropped by almost 60% over 12 years. The rainfall doesn't account for it." He was quiet again. She could hear the horses moving in their stalls, the ordinary sounds of a working barn, everything proceeding as normal, while the things she'd just laid out hung in the air between them. "Someone blocked the channel," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think so. I don't have documentation of that yet. That would require someone going up into the ridge country and actually looking." "My south pasture's been losing grass for 3 years," he said. He wasn't talking to her anymore. He was talking to himself, fitting something into place. "I thought it was the drought. Everyone thinks it's the drought." "It might have been both," she said. "A real drought and an engineered one, layered on top of each other. That would make it very hard to see." He looked at her then, a direct level look that she found she could hold without flinching. "Who else have you told?" "No one," she said. "You're the first." "Why me?" She had thought about this. She answered honestly. "Because you have enough land that you're not desperate yet. That means you still have something to lose, which means you have reason to fight. And because you listened to Doss when he told you what I did, and you didn't assume you already knew what kind of person I was." He picked up the harness again, turned it over in his hands, set it down. "I need a few days," he said. "The records office is already restricting access," she told him. "I don't know how much time we have." He nodded once, slowly. "I know, I said a few days, not a few weeks." He paused. "Don't talk to anyone else about this. Not yet." "I wasn't planning to." She picked up her notebook. She was almost to the barn door when he spoke again. "Miss Quinn?" She turned. He was looking at her with that same careful expression. "Doss told me the scarf was the best wool he'd seen in a long time. Said you must have worked on it a while." 11 days, she said. He nodded, like that told him something. Maybe it did. She walked back through the yard and out the gate and down the road toward town, the cold air pressing against her face, the notebook tucked under her arm, with everything in it that could either save the valley or get her quietly destroyed. She didn't feel brave. She felt the way she always felt when she'd committed to something she couldn't undo. A little sick, a little steadier than she expected, and very, very awake. The few days Ethan Crowe had asked for turned into 3, and Mara spent all of them waiting in a way that made her feel like she was back to being 12 years old and waiting for her father to come home from one of his trips into the Ridge country. She sewed. She read. She went through her notebook again and again, not because she'd missed anything, but because the act of reviewing it gave her the feeling that she was doing something instead of just sitting still while the world made its decisions without her. On the morning of the 4th day, Doss appeared at her door. He didn't come inside. He stood on the step with the wool scarf around his neck and told her, in as few words as possible, that Crowe wanted to meet her at the south fence line of his property at noon, away from the main road and away from the ranch house, where anyone coming or going could be seen from the bunkhouse windows. She didn't ask why the precaution. She understood why the precaution. She was at the fence 20 minutes early. Crowe arrived on horseback at exactly noon, which told her he was a man who thought about time even when he didn't have to. He dismounted and tied the horse to the fence post and stood there with his hat in his hands for a moment, turning it by the brim the way men did when they were arranging words they weren't sure how to say. "I've been doing some looking of my own," he said. "What did you find?" "Enough to know you're not wrong." He set the hat on the fence post. "I've got a man who used to survey for the county. Worked the Ridge country back when the basin records were being drawn up. I asked him about the mountain channel, the one that fed the eastern springs before they rerouted it 20 years ago." Mara went still. "There was a reroute?" "Official one, yes. County project. They said the original channel was unstable and moved it about a mile south to a more reliable bed." He paused. "That reroute happened to redirect the main flow away from the lower basin parcels, the ones that are now the driest." "Was that intentional?" "My man doesn't know. He says the decision was made above his level, which was unusual for a county project of that size. Normally, the surveyors made those calls. This one came down from the commissioner's office already decided." She thought about that. 12 years ago. The timing matched what she'd found in the spring output records. "Who was on the commissioner's panel at the time?" Crowe looked at her. "A man named Aldous Vane." She knew the name. Everyone in Blackstone Ridge knew the name. Aldous Vane was the region's principal land attorney. Old money, old connections, the kind of man who had a hand in every significant transaction in the county without his name appearing on most of them. He had an office above the bank and a house on the north end of town that was larger than anything else on that street, and he moved through Blackstone Ridge with the ease of someone who had never once been told no. "Vane is Meridian Trust registered agent," she said. It wasn't a guess. She'd found it in the filings. She hadn't been certain what to do with it until now. Crowe nodded like he'd been hoping she already knew. "He's been their man since the company was formed, 11 years ago. 1 year before the channel reroute." "Yes." They stood at the fence with the cold air between them and the particular silence that falls when two people have just confirmed something neither of them wanted to be true. "There's a rancher named Holt," Crowe said after a moment. "Miles Holt. He's got 300 acres on the west side of the basin, been working it for 20 years. Last month he missed his second tax payment. I know because he came to me asking for a loan, which I gave him." He paused. 2 weeks after I gave him that loan, someone from Meridian Trust's office came to see him, offered to buy. He turned them down." "How long before they come back?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He picked up his hat. "If the drought continues through spring, which it will, because the water situation isn't going to fix itself, Holt won't make it to summer without either selling or defaulting. Either way, Meridian gets the parcel." Mara turned that over. Holt's parcel was on the west side. She pulled the picture of the valley together in her mind. The 14 acquisitions she'd documented, the water-adjacent parcels, the way the holdings had been clustering slowly around the basin's main water sources like a hand closing into a fist. Holt's land sat at the last remaining gap in that pattern. "If they get Holt's parcel," she said, "they control every significant water access point in the lower basin." "Yes," Crowe said, "and then every rancher south of my fence line is either paying whatever Meridian sets as a water use fee, or they're done." She'd understood the scale of it intellectually, reading her notebooks alone at her work table. Hearing it said out loud by a man who ran the largest ranch in the region made it feel different, more solid, more urgent. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. "Nobody, if I'm right about how well they've kept it contained." He looked at her directly. "The man who stopped you outside the records office. I know who he is. His name is Garrett Finch. He works for Vane's firm as an investigator, which means Vane's office already knows you've been looking at the records." The cold she felt then had nothing to do with the weather. "How long have they known?" "I don't know. Long enough to have Finch watching you, which means long enough to be concerned." He paused. "You said you have copies." "In my notebook. And 2 more I made separately and hid." He nodded. "Good. Keep them separate. Don't bring them all together in one place." He looked out across his south pasture, brown grass, hard-packed earth, the visible evidence of 3 years of slow water loss that he'd been attributing to weather. "I'm going to reach out to a lawyer I know in Harlan County, man named Breckett. He's not connected to anyone here, and he owes me a favor." "What kind of lawyer?" "The kind who's handled land fraud cases before, and won at least some of them." He said it without particular optimism. It was just a fact. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you go home, you keep your head down, and you don't let anyone know we've spoken. He picked up his hat and put it on. I know that's not easy for you. She almost said something sharp. Instead, she said, I've been keeping my head down for 4 years. I can manage a while longer. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her with that careful, level expression she was starting to recognize as his version of respect. Miss Quinn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. All right? Is there anything in those records that could be used against you? Anything that looks ambiguous or that someone could argue you obtained improperly? She had thought about this. The records I copied were public before they were restricted. My copies were made legally. My father's notes are his personal property, which I inherited. I haven't broken into anything, I haven't bribed anyone, and I haven't taken anything that wasn't mine to have. He held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said finally. That matters. He rode back toward the ranch. She walked home the long way, thinking. The problem with keeping her head down was that the town was watching her anyway. It wasn't obvious. It was never obvious in Blackstone Ridge, where most of the cruelty came packaged in polite concern. But she felt it in the way conversation stopped when she entered Calloway's, in the way the banker's wife, a woman named Gertrude Aldis, who had never in 4 years acknowledged Mara's existence, suddenly appeared at her door one afternoon with a jar of preserved peaches and a bright, inquiring smile. We've been worried about you, Gertrude said, looking past Mara's shoulder into the shack with the attentive curiosity of someone who had been sent to gather information. Living out here alone. It's so isolated. I'm fine, Mara said. She didn't open the door wider. I only ask because people have noticed you've been spending time at the county office lately, records and things. The smile didn't waver. It's such dusty work. I can't imagine why you'd want to spend your time on it. I'm interested in my father's land history, Mara said. That was technically true. He kept notes, and I've been trying to make sense of them. Of course. Gertrude's eyes finally came back to her face. Well, if you ever need help with anything, or someone to talk to. She held out the peaches. We all just want to make sure you're all right, living alone like this. Mara took the peaches. She thanked her. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen holding the jar and thinking about the fact that Gertrude Aldis's husband managed the branch of the Blackstone Bank that handled Meridian Trust's local accounts. She knew because it was in the property transfer records. The Aldis Bank appeared in 7 of the 14 acquisitions. She put the peaches on the shelf. She didn't eat them. Look. 10 days after the fence line meeting, Crowe sent Doss with a message. The lawyer Breckett was coming. He'd be in Blackstone Ridge in 4 days, staying at the East Road boarding house under a name that wasn't his own, which Doss relayed with the flat delivery of someone who found spy work slightly undignified but was doing it anyway. Mara spent those 4 days making clean copies of everything. Her hands cramped. She worked by lamplight after dark, transferring the key entries into a second notebook she'd bought in the next town over when she'd had reason to go there for thread, paying cash, giving no name. She was not naturally a secretive person. Her father had raised her to say what she meant, and the constant management of what she showed and what she hid was exhausting in a way that was hard to explain. It sat on her like weather. The meeting with Breckett happened in the back room of a feed store owned by a man named Carl Pettis, who was Crowe's oldest friend and who had agreed to let them use the space with the minimal explanation that Crowe needed privacy for a business meeting. Pettis didn't ask questions. He brought a lamp, set it on the table, and left. Breckett was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a thin face and the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent more time at his desk than in courtrooms. He shook her hand without making a production of it, which she appreciated. He read through her notebook without comment for 20 minutes, while she and Crowe sat on opposite sides of the table and didn't talk much. The lamp burned. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the feed store, a horse at the rail, someone loading a wagon. Finally, Breckett looked up. You documented this yourself? He asked her. Over 4 years, she said, starting from my father's notes. Your father was George Quinn. Yes. He looked back at the notebook. He'd gotten pretty far along on this before he died. Some of these margin notes, he paused. Did he ever say anything to you about what he suspected? The question hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Her father had been sick for the last 18 months of his life, and his mind had gone in and out like a lamp in a draft. He'd said a lot of things in those months. She'd held on to what she could. He told me once that the valley was being starved deliberately, she said. I thought he was confused. He wasn't always lucid. Beckett nodded slowly. He closed the notebook, but gently, like it was something fragile. The water diversion is the center of this. Everything else, the acquisitions, the timing, the pricing, it's circumstantial without the channel evidence. Compelling circumstantial, but a good attorney could argue drought and economic hardship and get at least 2/3 of this thrown out. Then we need physical evidence from the ridge, Crowe said. You need someone who can get up there and document what was done to that channel, Beckett said. Photographs if possible, survey documentation, testimony from someone who can speak to the original condition and what's there now. My surveyor can do that, Crowe said. He's been up there before. He knows the original channel layout. He'll need to be willing to testify. Crowe's jaw tightened slightly. I'll talk to him. Beckett looked at Mara. There's something else. If Vane's office knows you've been in the records, and from what you're describing it sounds like they do, then they are likely already working on a counter-narrative. These operations don't survive this long without having contingency plans. He was direct about it, which she respected. They may try to discredit you before you can bring this forward. Discrediting someone in your position isn't difficult. You're a woman without significant standing, without money, without family connections. They only need to make you look unstable or opportunistic or like a poor widow's daughter trying to attach herself to Ethan Crowe's money, she said. Beckett didn't blink. Yes, exactly that. She'd known it was coming. Knowing didn't make it easier to hear. What do we do about that? We document your process, he said. The dates you accessed records, the copies you made, the sequence of your reasoning. We establish that your investigation predates any connection to Mr. Crowe by a significant margin, which it appears to do. We make it very difficult to argue that you were motivated by anything other than what you actually were motivated by. Which was? He looked at her. What were you motivated by? She thought about her father's margin notes, about the night she'd first noticed the discrepancy in the spring output records, and sat at her table for 2 hours with her heart going too fast, thinking about what it meant. About Doss and his quiet dignity, and the scarf she'd made from good wool because a stranger had helped her, and she'd wanted to say thank you in a way that meant something. My father spent 30 years in this valley, she said. He worked his land, he dealt straight with people, he believed the place was worth something. Then the water went and the land went and he died thinking he'd failed somehow. He hadn't failed. Someone made it fail deliberately. She paused. That's what I was motivated by. Beckett held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up a pen. All right, he said. Let's start from the beginning. What? They were in that back room for 3 hours. By the end of it, Mara's hand ached from writing and Beckett had filled a full pad with notes, and Crowe had said maybe 40 words total, most of them useful. The lamp had burned low enough that they were working in near shadow when Beckett finally sat back and looked at what they'd built together on paper. This is workable, he said. It's not fast and it's not certain, but it's workable. How long? Crowe asked. If your surveyor can get into the ridge country within the next few weeks and bring back solid documentation, and if the county records can be accessed through state channels before Vane's office has them fully restricted, 3 months, maybe 4, before we have something we can bring to a state land commission. Holt doesn't have 3 months, Crowe said. No, Beckett agreed. He didn't offer a solution to that because there wasn't a clean one. Mara thought about Miles Holt, whom she'd never met, but who had become real to her through the abstract fact of his missed tax payments and the loan Crowe had given him. 300 acres in 20 years, and a company waiting just out of sight, very patient, very sure of what was coming. Can we tell him? She asked. Warn him, at least? Crowe and Beckett exchanged a look. If Holt knows, Beckett said carefully, and if he reacts, if he goes to anyone in town, talks to the wrong person. He might not, she said. He might be exactly the kind of man who keeps something to himself if he's given a reason to. You don't know him, Crowe said. No, she said. You do. Crowe was quiet for a moment. He's stubborn, he said finally. Not stupid, stubborn. Then maybe he keeps his mouth shut and doesn't sell, she said, which buys us time. It wasn't a perfect solution. She could see on both their faces that it wasn't a perfect solution, but perfect solutions required a different kind of problem. Let me think about Holt, Crowe said. What? Walking home that night, late enough that the town was quiet, the main street empty, the cold sharp and clean. Mara became aware that she was being followed. She didn't stop walking. She didn't turn around. She'd read enough of her father's margin notes to know that stopping and turning was exactly what you didn't do, because it told the person behind you that you knew, and once they knew you knew, the situation changed. She kept her pace steady. She took the route she usually took, right up until the last intersection before her road, where she turned left instead of right, and went 2 blocks out of her way through the petty side street and then doubled back through the narrow gap between the tannery and the feed store. She'd walked this town every day for 4 years. She knew every shortcut, every alley, every place a fence had a gap. By the time she reached her shack, there was no one behind her. She bolted the door. She stood in the dark for a moment, listening, heart loud in her ears, before she let herself light the lamp. She sat at her work table and opened her notebook. She wrote down the date in a single line. I believe I was followed home tonight. The investigation is visible. Then she closed the notebook and put it in its place under the table, below the loose board, where the second copy already was. She did not sleep well. She hadn't expected to. The next morning, she went to see a woman named Nell Foss. Nell was 60 years old and had been living in Blackstone Ridge since before most of the current residents were born. She ran the only boarding house on the East Road, the one where Breckett was staying, and she had the particular quality of someone who had seen everything and filed most of it away without comment. She'd been George Quinn's friend, which meant she was one of the few people in town who had known Mara since she was a child and felt no need to perform an opinion about her. Mara didn't tell Nell everything. She told her enough. She told her that she'd found something in her father's records that she believed was important, and that she was working with people she trusted to address it through proper channels, and that in the meantime, she thought it was possible someone might try to make her look bad to the town as a way of undercutting whatever she'd found. She asked Nell simply to be a witness, to know, as an independent person, that Mara had been working on this alone and for years before anything else had happened. Nell listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table and her expression giving nothing away. When Mara finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your father knew something was wrong, Nell said. It wasn't a question. I think he did, near the end. He told me once that the valley was being bled dry by people who didn't live in it, Nell said. I thought he meant drought and hard times and the usual. I didn't... She stopped. He wasn't talking about the usual, was he? No, Mara said. He wasn't. Nell looked out the window for a moment, at the street and the ordinary morning business of the town. Then she looked back at Mara. What do you need from me? Just to know, Mara said. Just to be someone who knows. Nell nodded once. I know, she said. I've known you since you were 8 years old, Mara Quinn, and I know what your father was and what you are. That's worth something when the time comes. She wasn't offering heroics. She was offering exactly what Mara had asked for, the weight of a credible witness who had nothing to gain. It was the most practical kind of help, and it was the kind her father would have thought to gather too, and she felt something ease slightly in her chest. 2 days later, the man from the records office, young Potts, appeared at her door. He looked terrible. He hadn't been sleeping, from the look of him, and he was wearing his coat like he'd put it on in a hurry. He glanced behind him before she stepped aside to let him in, and he stood in the middle of her small room with his hat clutched in both hands and told her something she hadn't expected. They didn't just restrict the records you were looking at, he said. They've been replacing them. She went cold. Replacing them. Not all of them, specific entries. The transfer documents for 4 of the parcels. The ones with the water rights attached. Someone came in with amended versions and filed them as corrections. I wasn't supposed to be there when it happened, but I was in the back and... He stopped. He was sweating despite the cold. Miss Quinn, if those amendments go through as official, the original transfer terms are going to be buried. What's in the file now doesn't match what was there before. You saw the originals, she said. I've been working there 3 years. I've handled those files a dozen times. She looked at him. He was frightened, genuinely frightened, the kind that made your hands shake and your voice go thin, not the kind that made you stupid. Mr. Potts, she said carefully, what made you come here? He was quiet for a moment. My father farmed 12 acres on the East Basin. 7 years ago, he sold to a company called Meridian Trust, because the water on his land had been going bad for 2 years and he needed the money. He always thought he'd sold too cheap. He looked at his hat. I didn't know why until I started reading those files. The room was very quiet. Will you write down what you saw? She asked. The originals versus what they filed in their place? Dates, entry numbers, specific changes? In your own hand, with your name on it? He looked up at her. If I do that and they find out, I know, she said. I know what that means for you. He was silent for a long moment. Outside, a wagon went past on the road. Normal life proceeding. My father worked that land for 18 years, Potts said. He said it quietly, like he was telling it to the floor. He worked it, and he lost it, and he died thinking he just wasn't good enough to hold on to it. Mara Quinn knew exactly what that felt like. She didn't say so, she just waited. Get me paper, Potts said. She got him paper. She got him a pen. She set the lamp closer so he could see clearly, and she sat across the table from him while he wrote out everything he remembered, dates and entry numbers, and the specific language of the originals versus the amended versions. In the careful, slightly cramped hand of a man who had spent 3 years learning to be precise about documents. It took him 40 minutes. When he was done, his hand was shaking and his face was pale, and he looked like someone who had just walked off the edge of something and hadn't landed yet. She made a copy of what he'd written. She gave him the original. She told him to keep it somewhere safe that wasn't his home. He left the way he'd come, quickly, without looking back. She watched him go from her window, then stood at the table with the copy in her hands and the lamp throwing its small yellow circle against the winter dark. The picture had shifted. It wasn't just a pattern in land transfers anymore, and it wasn't just a question of water rights and timing. They were actively altering the record, which meant they were worried, which meant that somewhere in the past few weeks, something she or Crowe had done had made them feel exposed enough to start covering their tracks. She folded Potts's copy and put it with the others under the board. Then she went to the door and opened it and stood for a moment in the cold, looking at the road in both directions. She needed to get word to Crowe. Tonight, if possible. Because whatever timeline Beckett had calculated in that back room with the low-burning lamp, it had just gotten shorter, and Miles Holt wasn't the only one who was running out of time. She closed the door. She put on her coat. She went out into the dark to find Doss, and whatever came after that would have to be what it was, because there was no longer any version of this where she could wait and watch and be patient and still have anything left worth fighting for when it was over. Doss wasn't at the bunkhouse. He was at the small barn at the back of the Petty's property, doing something with a broken harness by lantern light, and when Mara appeared in the doorway, he looked up at her face and put the harness down without asking any questions. I need to get word to Crowe tonight, she said. How urgent? Urgent enough that I walked here in the dark. He nodded once. He wiped his hands on his trousers, picked up his coat from the nail by the door, and told her to wait. He was back in 20 minutes with word that Crowe would meet her at Pettis's back room in an hour, and that Pettis had been asked and had said yes without asking why, which was the kind of friend worth having. She waited in the feed store with the lamp low, going through what she knew in the order she'd present it. When Crowe came in, he was still wearing his work clothes, which meant he'd come directly from whatever he'd been doing at the ranch. And he sat down across from her and listened without interrupting while she told him about Potts and the amended records and what it meant about the timeline. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How reliable is Potts? He's frightened, she said, but he wrote it down anyway and he put his name on it. His father lost land to Meridian. That could be used to argue he's motivated by personal grievance. So could everything I've done, she said. That doesn't make it untrue. He looked at her steadily. No, he said, it doesn't. He leaned back in his chair. I need to contact Beckett tonight. He's still at Nell's. He needs to know about the amendments before he makes any moves through the state channels. If Vane's office gets ahead of him, I know. He stood up. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just had more weight added. Not breaking, just recalibrating. Go home. Lock your door. Keep the copies where they are. He paused at the door. How did Potts know to come to you? She hadn't thought about that until now. The question landed differently in the quiet of the feed store than it would have out in the open. He didn't say. Crowe's expression didn't change. Ask him, he said. When you see him next, ask him how he knew where to find you and who, if anyone, suggested it. He left. She sat for a moment in the low lamplight, thinking about that. Potts had come to her door like he knew where she lived, which she supposed most people in Blackstone Ridge did know. Her shack wasn't a secret, but the specific timing, the specific night, the specific information he'd brought. She'd taken it at face value because the information had been real, and his fear had been real, and his father's story had been real. She thought about it the whole walk home. She didn't reach a conclusion. That bothered her. She slept poorly and woke early and went to the records office before it opened, waiting on the step in the cold until Potts arrived. He startled when he saw her, then looked around the empty street the way he'd been doing since last night. Checking, always checking. "How did you know where I lived?" she asked him. Not unkindly, just directly. He looked at her. "Mrs. Fossey told me." Nell. Mara turned that over. She'd told Nell that people might try to discredit her, that she needed a witness. She hadn't told Nell about Potts or the records office, but Nell was old and had been in this town forever, and had known things Mara hadn't known for most of Mara's life. "Did she tell you to come to me?" Potts hesitated. "She told me that if I knew something about the land records that wasn't right, there was someone who would know what to do with it." He paused. "I'd been sitting on what I saw for a week. I didn't know what to do." Then Mrs. Fossey said, she said George Quinn's daughter had her father's head for records, and her father's sense of what mattered. She said I could trust you. Mara exhaled slowly. All right. That was Nell being Nell. Old woman, long memory, the particular instinct of someone who had been watching a town for 60 years and knew which threads to pull. It was all right. "Has anyone from Vane's office spoken to you since you filed those amendments?" she asked. "Not yet. They may not know I was in the back room when it happened." "Be careful," she said. "If they ask you anything, you don't know anything." "I know," he said. He was still frightened, but steadier than the night before. Writing it down had done something for him. She recognized that. She'd felt it herself, the first time she'd gotten her father's notes into a coherent order and seen the shape of what he'd found. Putting a true thing on paper made it harder to pretend you hadn't seen it. Book. Breckett left Blackstone Ridge 3 days later, quietly and early, before the town was fully awake. He took Mara's copied documentation with him. The originals stayed hidden under the board. And he carried Potts's written account folded inside the lining of his coat, which he mentioned only to Crowe, and which Crowe mentioned to Mara in passing, as a detail she found both sensible and slightly grim. The plan, as Breckett had revised it, he would file for access to the original pre-amendment records through the State Land Commission in the capital, arguing that a pattern of suspicious alterations in county filings warranted state review. It was a slow process. It required the commission to agree there was cause, which required Breckett to be persuasive with people he didn't know well, on behalf of people in a small valley town they'd never visited, about a company whose principals had the kind of money that bought influence in capital cities as easily as anywhere else. 3 months, he'd said originally. Now he was saying possibly 2, if the commission moved faster than expected. Possibly 4, if it didn't. In the valley, things continued to move faster than that. Miles Holt came to Crowe's ranch on a Tuesday morning, Crowe told Mara this afterward, and sat in the ranch kitchen with his hat in his hands, and told Crowe that Meridian Trust had sent a second representative, a different man than the first, with a new offer that was somewhat better than the original, but still well below what the land was worth. He'd turned it down again. The representative had been polite. He'd said he understood, and that the offer would remain open, and that with the water situation being what it was, Holt should feel free to reconsider when circumstances changed. When circumstances changed. Not if. When. Crowe told Holt enough. Not everything. Not Breckett. Not the state commission filing. Not the specific evidence. But enough that Holt understood the water shortage was not weather, and that there were people working on it, and that if he could hold on for another few months without selling, it would be worth it. Holt had listened to all of this with the expression of a man who had been carrying a private suspicion for a long time and had just been told he wasn't imagining it. He cried, Crowe told Mara, and he said it plainly, without any quality of judgment in it. Just for a minute. Then he wiped his face and asked me what he needed to do. What did you tell him? Hold on. Don't sell. Don't tell anyone. Crowe paused. And if Meridian's man comes back again, stall. Ask for more time to consider. Give us whatever extra days he can. Mara nodded. She was thinking about the mountain channel, about Brackett's surveyor who had never confirmed he would testify. Has your surveyor agreed yet? Crowe's jaw did the thing it did when the answer was complicated. He's agreed to go up and document. He hasn't agreed to put his name on testimony. We need him to put his name on testimony. I know that. Then what's stopping him? He has a wife and 3 children, and he worked for the county for 15 years, and he's worried about what happens to his pension if he's seen as the man who brought down a county commissioner's pet project from 12 years ago. She understood that. She understood it better than she would have liked. Fear of losing what little you had was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. Is there anything that would change his mind? Crowe thought about it. He told me that if there were other people on record, other voices, not just yours and mine, he'd feel less exposed. Other voices. She thought about Nell, she thought about Potts, she thought about Miles Holt and his 20 years on that West Basin land and the representative who'd said, when circumstances change, like it was already decided. She thought about the 14 families she'd tracked in the records, most of whom had already sold and moved on, gone to wherever people went when the place they'd built their life on was taken from under them. Those families were gone. But there were others still here, people watching their water tables drop and their grass go brown and their cattle thin out, attributing it all to weather, because weather was the explanation that didn't require them to believe something more frightening. I need to talk to some people, she said. Crowe looked at her carefully. That's a risk. Everything is a risk at this point. She met his gaze. We have documentation. We have Potts. We have your surveyor willing to go up the ridge. What we don't have is a reason for the state commission to treat this as urgent rather than just unusual. If we can show them it's not one family, not one parcel, if we can show them it's a pattern affecting an entire community, the more people who know, the more chances for it to get back to Vane. Yes, she said, that's true. But Vane already knows something is happening. He amended those records, which means he's already moving. The question isn't whether he finds out. He already knows enough. The question is whether we build something solid enough that it doesn't matter what he knows. It was quiet in the barn where they were standing. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Crowe turned the thing over for a long moment. Who? He asked. She'd been thinking about it. Carl Pettis. He's already in it by letting us use his space. He should know what he's in it for. And there's a woman named Ada Stroud. She runs the millinery on the South Street, and her family had 40 acres on the East Basin that they sold to Meridian 4 years ago for less than it was worth. She's never said anything publicly, but I've seen the way she watches Vane's men walk past her window. She knows something happened. She just doesn't know what. She paused. And Holt. He's already heard enough. He should be part of the decision about what happens next. Crowe was quiet for another moment. If this goes wrong, I know. No, he said. I mean, if this goes wrong, you're the most exposed person here. You have the least protection. I need you to understand that before we go any wider with this. She'd understood it since the night she'd been followed home and had stood in her dark kitchen with her heart hammering, writing the date in her notebook. She'd understood it before that, if she was honest, since the morning Garrett Finch had blocked her path outside the records office and told her, with that pleasant smile, that small lives were manageable ones. I understand it, she said. I've understood it for a while. He nodded. He didn't try to talk her out of it or reassure her or make it seem smaller than it was, and she found she was grateful for that. She'd had enough of people trying to make things smaller than they were. She went to Ada Stroud on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day when the millinery was quiet between the morning customers and the evening ones. Ada was in the back when Mara came in, and she appeared through the curtain with a length of ribbon in her hand and an expression that shifted through several things very quickly when she saw who it was. Mara Quinn, she said. The tone was neutral, which was neither warm nor cold and therefore told Mara nothing yet. I need to talk to you about your East Basin land, Mara said. The 40 acres you sold 4 years ago. Ada Stroud's face went very still. The ribbon stayed in her hands. That's done business. I know it is, Mara said. I'm not here about undoing it. I'm here because I've found documentation that suggests what happened to your land wasn't weather, and that the company you sold to has been doing the same thing to other families in this valley for over a decade. And I'd like you to know about it, and I'd like to know what you know. Ada stood there for a long moment. She was a thin woman in her 50s with capable hands and the look of someone who had been managing her feelings in public for so long that she'd gotten very efficient at it. She walked to the front of the shop and turned the sign in the window to closed. Then she came back and put the ribbon down on the counter. "Sit down," she said. "This is going to take a minute." Ada Stroud's family had been on that East Basin land for 16 years. The water had started declining in year 12. Slow at first, barely noticeable, the kind of change you attributed to the season and then to the year and then, when you couldn't attribute it anymore, to something broken in the land itself. Her husband had tried everything: deeper wells, rerouted drainage, different crops. Nothing had worked. They'd sold in the end because the alternative was losing it for taxes and getting nothing at all, and at least the sale had given them enough to open the millinery. She'd known, she told Mara, that something wasn't right. Not in any specific documented way. She hadn't had access to land records or survey data or any of the things Mara had spent 4 years reading. But she'd known the way a woman who had worked a piece of land for 16 years knows when something unnatural is wrong with it. The water didn't decline the way drought made water decline. It declined the way water declined when something upstream had changed. "I never said that to anyone," Ada said. "Who would I say it to? Who would believe a milliner arguing with a land company?" "I believe you," Mara said, "and I can show you why." She opened her notebook. Ada read slowly, asking questions about entries she didn't understand, and Mara answered them. By the time Ada looked up, the afternoon light through the shop window had shifted 2 hours. "How many families?" Ada asked. 14 that I've documented. There are likely more that moved away before I started looking." Ada was quiet. "My husband's sister is on the North Basin. She's been losing water for 2 years. She looked at her hands. "She thinks it's the drought." "It may not be." Ada looked up at her. "What do you need from me?" "Right now? To know. To be one more person who knows." Mara closed the notebook. "When the time comes, we may need voices. People who can speak to what they saw on their own land, in their own words. I can't tell you yet what that will look like or what it will cost. My husband's going to want to know about this." "That's your decision to make." Ada was quiet for a moment. "He's a cautious man. He's going to be frightened." "Caution is reasonable," Mara said. "Being frightened is reasonable. I'm not asking anyone to be otherwise." Ada studied her for a moment. "You're not frightened?" Mara thought about the most honest answer. "I'm frightened all the time," she said. "I just can't stop." Ada nodded slowly, like that was the only answer she would have trusted. Pettis already knew more than Mara had given him credit for. When Crowe brought him into the full picture, in the same back room where Beckett had spent 3 hours with the lamp burning low, Pettis listened with his arms folded and his chin down and then said, without any particular drama, "Aldous Vane has been handling property law in this county for 30 years. He has 3 men on the commissioner's panel who eat dinner at his house twice a year, and the county sheriff went to school with his son." Crowe and Mara looked at each other. "I'm not saying it can't be done," Pettis said. "I'm saying don't count on anything local. Whatever you're building, it has to come from outside or it's not going to hold." "Beckett is working the state commission," Crowe said. "Then Beckett needs to move." Pettis unfolded his arms. "I'll do what I can from here. I've been buying grain from 3 of the families on your list, Quinn. I know their situations. I can talk to them." He looked at Mara. "Your father would have been the one to do this. He had a way of talking to people that made them feel like fighting back was sensible rather than suicidal." She felt that in a place she'd learned to keep quiet. "I know," she said. "He was better at it than I am." "Maybe," Pettis said. "But you've got his records and his stubborn—" It was the surveyor, a man named Theo Calder, who changed things. Calder had been putting off the Ridge Country survey for 2 weeks, which Crowe had attributed to his fear about testimony, and which Mara had accepted because she didn't have a better explanation. Then on a Friday morning in the 3rd week, Crowe arrived at the feed store looking like he hadn't slept and told her that Calder's fence had been cut overnight and 6 of his cattle had wandered through the gap onto the north road. No cattle had been hurt, no property beyond the fence, but the message was not subtle. "Did he report it?" Mara asked. "To the county sheriff," Crowe said, with the same tone Pettis had used when he'd mentioned the sheriff's friendship with Vane's son. "So nothing will come of the report." "No, but something came of the fence." He looked at her. "Calder's going up the ridge on Monday. Said a man who cuts fences in the dark to warn him off is a man who's scared of what he'll find, and he'd rather know what it is than spend the rest of his life wondering. She absorbed that. Fear worked in both directions, it turned out. Push a frightened man hard enough, and sometimes he stopped being frightened and started being angry, and anger was a different kind of fuel. He'll need someone with him, she said. Someone who can document what he finds in writing as he finds it. Photographs if there's equipment. He has a survey camera. It's basic, but it works. Crowe paused. I'm going with him. You can't. If you're seen in the Ridge country right now, I'm not asking your permission, he said. Not harshly, just plainly. She looked at him. Then take Doss. He's got eyes, and he knows how to keep his mouth shut. I was already planning to take Doss. And document everything twice, she said. Every measurement, every photograph, 2 written records, 2 copies. Don't come back with only one version of anything. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there. You sound like your father. Pettis said the same thing, she said. I'll take it. They were gone for 2 days. Mara spent those 2 days in a state of controlled anxiety that she managed by working. She took in every sewing job she had a backlog on, hemmed 4 pairs of trousers, completed a wool vest she'd been putting off, and read through her father's notes for what felt like the 100th time. She also wrote out a clean chronological account of her investigation from the beginning. Every date, every source, every finding, in language that assumed no prior knowledge, as if she were explaining it to someone who had never heard of Blackstone Ridge or Meridian Trust or the slow, deliberate draining of a valley. She didn't know exactly who she was writing it for yet. She just knew it needed to exist. On the second evening, just after dark, someone threw a rock through her window. It wasn't large. It didn't do much damage beyond the glass, which shattered inward and left a cold hole in her wall that she stuffed with a rolled blanket until morning. There was nothing tied to the rock, no note, no message beyond the rock itself. She stood in her kitchen for a moment with the cold air pouring in through the broken window, looking at the rock on her floor, and she felt something that she recognized after a moment as a specific kind of clarity. She was past the point of hoping this would go quietly. She was past the point of hoping that careful research and proper channels and slow, methodical documentation would be enough by themselves. Those things were necessary. They were the foundation. They were the only way any of this would hold up when it mattered. But they were not sufficient. You needed the foundation, and you needed something to build on it fast enough that the people trying to bury it couldn't get ahead of the construction. She picked up the rock. She put it on her work table as if it were a piece of evidence, which it was. Then she sat down and kept writing. Crowe and Doss came back on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Calder was with them, and Calder looked like a man who had found what he was looking for and wished he hadn't, which was not the same thing as wishing he'd stayed home. He had a leather case with him that held the survey camera and the exposed plates and his field notes, and he set it on Pettis's table and opened it with the careful hands of someone who understood that what he was holding was fragile in more ways than one. The original channel, he said, was blocked approximately 11 years ago. I can say approximately because the obstruction materials have weathered to a degree consistent with that timeline. It wasn't natural. There's evidence of deliberate excavation and fill work, large scale, the kind that would have required equipment and multiple workers over at least several days. He laid out 3 photographs. Even in the basic quality of a survey camera, the images were clear enough to show what had been done. The fill has diverted roughly 70% of the channel's flow away from the lower basin drainage system. The water that should be feeding the east and west springs is going south, away from the valley. Mara looked at the photographs. She'd known this intellectually for weeks. Seeing it was different. There was something in her that wanted to be surprised, even now, and wasn't. What she felt instead was a kind of exhausted, focused fury that was the most useful emotion she'd had in a long time. Can you testify to this? She asked Calder. He looked at the photographs for a moment. My wife says I should, he said. She found out about the fence. What do you say? He looked up. I was a quiet man, heavy-set, with the particular tiredness of someone who had been keeping a difficult thing to himself for too long. I say I surveyed that channel 20 years ago, and I know what it looked like before someone put equipment up there and changed it, and there's nobody else left who was there for both surveys. He paused. So, yes, I'll testify. Mara looked at Crowe. Crowe looked at the photographs. Pettis, who had been standing in the corner saying nothing, made a sound that might have been relief. I need to get these to Breckett, Mara said. I'll ride to Harlan County tomorrow, Crowe said. Tonight, she said. It should be tonight. He looked at her. She didn't explain about the window. She'd tell him later. But something in her face told him enough. Tonight, he said. She wrote a letter to Breckett while Crowe prepared to ride, working by lamplight at the corner of Pettis's table, writing quickly but precisely. She told him about the amended records and pots. She told him about the photographs and Calder's willingness to testify. She told him about Pettis and Ada Stroud and Miles Holt and the slow, difficult work of building a coalition of voices out of people who were frightened and tired and had already lost too much to feel certain of anything. She told him that the timeline had to move faster, that someone had cut Calder's fence and broken her window, and that Vane's office was no longer being subtle. She gave the letter to Crowe. He folded it into his coat, the same place Breckett had carried Potts's account, and said nothing dramatic about it, because he wasn't a dramatic man. Be careful, she said. Always, he said. Then with a slight pause, you too. She stayed at the feed store after he left, going over the photographs with Calder and taking her own written notes from his verbal account, because 2 records were always better than 1, and she'd been raised by a man who never assumed that a single copy of anything important was enough. Outside, Blackstone Ridge was doing what it always did after dark, going quiet, turning inward, proceeding under the assumption that tomorrow would be much like today. It would not be much like today. She didn't know yet what it would be, but she knew that the things she and Crowe and Calder and Potts and Pettis and Ada and Holt and Nell Fossey had been quietly, carefully building in the margins of this town's regular life was now large enough that it had its own weight, its own momentum, and that the people trying to stop it were going to have to work a great deal harder than a cut fence and a broken window to do it. She kept writing until her hand ached. Then she stopped, packed her notes away, said goodnight to Pettis and Calder, and walked home through the cold and the dark with her eyes open and her pace steady. And she did not run, and she did not look behind her more than twice. Breckett's reply came 6 days after Crowe rode to Harlan County, carried back not by Crowe himself, but by a man Breckett trusted, a former land commission clerk named Aldridge, who had left state employment 2 years earlier under circumstances that had never been fully explained, and who had, according to Breckett's letter, very specific reasons for wanting to see Meridian Trust examined by people with the authority to do something about it. Mara read the letter twice at her work table, then a third time to be sure she hadn't misread the central piece of it. The State Land Commission had agreed to open a preliminary inquiry. Not a full investigation, not yet, but an inquiry, which meant they had reviewed Breckett's initial filing and found sufficient cause to look further. It meant that the amended records in the county office were now subject to state scrutiny and could not be altered again without constituting an additional offense. It meant that Aldous Vane's ability to manage this situation locally through the county commissioner panels and the bank and the sheriff who had gone to school with his son had just become significantly more complicated. It also meant, Breckett's letter made clear, that the next 4 to 6 weeks would be the most dangerous period of the entire proceeding. An inquiry without a full investigation was a fragile thing. It could be derailed, delayed, quietly discouraged by the right pressure applied to the right people at the commission level. Meridian Trust had money and Vane had connections, and both of those things traveled well. What the inquiry needed, before it could harden into something that couldn't be derailed, was testimony. Specific, named, documented testimony from people who could speak to direct experience. Not just Calder's survey evidence, not just Mara's paper trail, but human voices attached to real losses, delivered under oath before commission officials who had the power to compel further action. Breckett was coming back to Blackstone Ridge. He'd arrive in 4 days. He needed everyone Mara had spoken to, Pettis, Ada Stroud, Holt, Potts, Calder, to be willing to meet with him and, if they agreed, to sign sworn statements that could be forwarded to the commission. He needed this to happen quickly and quietly, before Vane's office understood what the inquiry actually meant. Mara put the letter down. She looked at the broken window she'd re-glazed herself 3 days earlier, the new glass slightly uneven in the frame, the putty still pale from where it hadn't fully cured. She thought about 5 people, each of them frightened in different ways and for different reasons, each of them carrying a private calculation about what they stood to lose, and she thought about what it would take to ask them to put their names on paper before a state official when the man who'd cut Theo Calder's fence at midnight and thrown a rock through her window was still walking around Blackstone Ridge in clean boots and a good wool coat. She folded the letter. She put on her coat. She went to find Nell Fossey first, because Nell was the one person in this town who had never once treated information as a burden. Nell read Brackett's letter at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on and her tea going cold beside her. When she finished, she took her glasses off and set them down and looked at Mara with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen and had stopped being surprised that it finally had. "He's right about the timing," Nell said. "Vane's going to find out about the inquiry. He probably already knows. Men like that have ears in capital offices." "I know," Mara said, "which is why Brackett needs the statements before Vane has time to work on people." "Who are you most worried about?" Mara thought about it honestly. "Potts. He's the youngest and he has the least to stand behind. And his position at the records office means Vane's people can reach him every single day." She paused. "And Holt. He's angry and that's useful, but angry men make decisions fast and not always well." Nell nodded. "Ada will hold. She's been holding that anger for 4 years already. She knows how to manage it." She picked up her tea, found it cold, set it back down. "What do you need from me?" "Be there when Brackett meets with them. Not as a witness in the formal sense. He has what he needs for that. But as," Mara tried to find the right word, "ballast. Someone who's been here long enough that people trust her read of the situation." Nell looked at her for a moment. "You're asking me to be your character witness without calling it that." "Yes," Mara said. "I suppose I am." "Your father would have asked more directly." "My father was better with people than I am." Nell smiled, which was a rare enough event that it tended to mean something. "He wasn't, actually. He was just less aware of the gap." She stood up. "I'll be there. Tell me when and where." "What?" Crowe came back to Blackstone Ridge the same day. Mara was making her rounds. She didn't see him until that evening, when Doss appeared at her door and said simply that Crowe was at Pettis's and wanted to talk. She'd been half expecting something to have gone wrong during the 6 days he'd been traveling, some problem that had developed in the valley while she'd been managing the local pieces, and the expression on his face when she walked into the feed store's back room confirmed that something had. He was sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of him. Not Brackett's letter. She'd already shared the relevant contents with him through Doss. Something else. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Garrett Finch, Vane's investigator, the man who stopped you outside the records office, has been making inquiries around town. Not subtle ones. He's been asking people about you specifically, your habits, your finances, your relationship with me." He paused on that last phrase just long enough that she understood he was being precise about the word relationship and what Finch had been implying by asking about it. He spoke to Louise Hargrave. He spoke to the banker Aldous. He spoke to 2 of the women who bring me sewing work. She kept her expression level. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you've been struggling financially, whether you've expressed bitterness about losing your family's ranch, whether people have noticed you spending time at my property." He looked at her directly. "He's building a story. A poor woman with a grievance, attaching herself to a wealthy rancher, manufacturing a conspiracy to make herself relevant, and possibly to extort a settlement from a legitimate land company. She'd known this was coming. Brackett had told her it was coming. Knowing it and hearing the specific shape of it were 2 different things. Who's listening to him? Some people. The Hargrave woman, definitely. She's already started talking about it. The Aldous family will stay quiet until they see which direction the wind blows." He picked up the paper. "But here's the part I needed to tell you in person. Finch went to see Potts yesterday afternoon, at the records office. I found out from Calder, who heard it from someone who works in the building." Her stomach tightened. "What happened?" "I don't know yet. Potts didn't come to work this morning." The tightening became something more specific and harder. "Where is he?" "I don't know that either." Crowe set the paper down. "I've had someone looking. He wasn't at his rooming house last night." She stood up. She wasn't sure why standing helped, but it did. "Finch either scared him off or he got to him some other way," Crowe said. "Yes. I've been considering both." He was careful in the way he said it, which told her he'd been sitting with the worst version of the possibilities for longer than she had. "We need to find Potts before Brackett gets here. If Potts has gone to Vane's office with what he knows, he wouldn't, Mara said. Then more honestly, I don't think he would, but I thought that before I knew Finch had spoken to him. People make different calculations under different kinds of pressure, Crowe said. That's not a judgment, it's just true. She knew it was true. She also knew that Potts had written his account by lamplight at her kitchen table with shaking hands, and then looked up at her and said, "My father worked that land for 18 years. People who said things like that from that place didn't usually fold, but she didn't know what Finch had said to him, or what had been offered or threatened, and she didn't know what Potts's breaking point was, because no one knew their own breaking point until they reached it. I need to find him tonight, she said. Doss is already looking, Crowe said. But Mara, he used her first name rarely enough that it registered. If Potts has gone to Vane's office, his written account is now in their hands, and they know that you have a copy. She thought about what that meant for what was under the board in her floor. They'll want it back, or they'll want it discredited, which means they'll come for you more directly than a thrown rock. She looked at him. Then we need Breckett here faster than 4 days. I sent word ahead with Aldridge before he left. Breckett may already be moving. He folded his hands on the table. In the meantime, I want you to stay somewhere other than your shack tonight. If I disappear from my own home, it's one night, Nell's house. You can be back by morning. She wanted to argue. The part of her that had been refusing to be moved or frightened for 4 years wanted to go home and bolt the door and stay in the place that was hers. But that part of her had also patched a broken window alone and lay awake 3 nights running, listening to the sounds of the road, and it was tired. All right, she said. One night. So, Potts turned up the following morning. He came to Nell's house, not Mara's shack, which meant either that Nell's was his second stop or that someone had told him where she was. He looked like he'd slept in his clothes, which he had. He'd spent the night in the hayloft of a livery stable on the East Road, he told her, because after Finch had left the records office, he'd stood at his desk for 20 minutes trying to think clearly and had decided that going home was the one thing he definitely shouldn't do. What did Finch say to you? Mara asked. They were in Nell's back room, the 3 of them. Nell had brought coffee without being asked and had sat down in the corner like she was part of the furniture, which was a skill Mara had come to appreciate deeply. He said he knew I'd been feeding information to a woman with a personal vendetta against Meridian Trust, Potts said. He was holding his coffee with both hands. He said I'd been misled about what she was doing and why. He said the documents I'd described as amendments were routine corrections that the office had a legal right to make, and that my characterization of them as replacements demonstrated that I'd been manipulated into misunderstanding standard procedure. That's not what they were, Mara said. I know that, Potts said with a flash of something sharp. I was there. I read both versions. I know what a routine correction looks like, and I know what a replacement looks like. He's wrong, and he knows he's wrong. What did you tell him? I said I didn't know what he was talking about. I said I'd noticed the files had been updated and hadn't thought anything more about it. I said I certainly hadn't spoken to anyone about office records. He looked at his coffee. He didn't believe me. He said he hoped I understood that providing false information to the county records office, or removing documents or describing them inaccurately to unauthorized parties, was a matter that could affect my employment and potentially my legal standing. There it was. Not a threat with a knife in it. A threat with a ledger. The particular kind of violence that men like Finch and Vane had perfected, the kind that arrived in suits and spoke in the language of legal consequence and left you feeling like the floor had tilted without anyone touching you. He's trying to make you think you did something wrong, Nell said from the corner. Her voice was calm. You didn't. He's hoping you'll come to believe the story he's telling about what happened before anyone else can tell you the true one. Potts looked at her. He looked at Mara. He looked like a young man who had walked into something larger than he'd understood when he started and was in the process of deciding whether to keep walking. My account, he said. The one I wrote at your table. They know about it? They suspect it exists, Mara said. They may not know exactly what's in it. My copy is secure. She paused. The question is whether you want to stand behind it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Nell's house made its small sounds. A board settling, the stove ticking. Ordinary life, all of it. If I stand behind it, he said, and the commission doesn't move fast enough, or the case falls apart, then you've lost your job and possibly more, Mara said. She wasn't going to soften it. That's the real calculation. I can't tell you it isn't. But if it works, the people who've been stealing water from this valley for 11 years are held accountable by a state body with the authority to reverse what they've done and prevent them from doing it again. She looked at him steadily. I can't promise it works. I can tell you that every piece we have is real, and Beckett is good, and the commission has agreed to look. That's more than we had 3 months ago. Potts set his coffee down. He looked at his hands. He was maybe 24 years old, Mara thought, young enough that this was still the kind of decision that felt enormous because he hadn't yet had enough of them to know how you got through to the other side. She remembered being that age and her father being sick, and looking at his land records for the first time and thinking, this is too large, I can't hold it. She'd held it anyway. You mostly could. I'll stand behind it, Potts said. He said it quietly, like he was telling himself as much as her. Nell made a small sound in the corner that might have been approval and might have been relief, and was probably both. Beckett arrived not in 4 days but in 2, which meant he'd already been on the road when Aldridge had reached him with Mara's update. He came in the early morning, before the town was active, and went directly to Nell's boarding house where Crowe had arranged for him to have a room under the same borrowed name as before. He looked tired and purposeful, which was a combination she'd come to associate with people who were doing something real under time pressure. He shook her hand. He said, without preamble, the commission has set a date, 6 weeks from now, preliminary hearing, Capital City, before 3 commissioners. Everything we have needs to be in formal sworn statements and submitted at least 10 days prior. 6 weeks. She did the arithmetic automatically. That's enough time if we start immediately. We start today, Beckett said. I need to meet everyone individually. Calder first. His survey documentation is the structural core of the physical evidence. Then Potts, then the others. He looked at her. And you. Your chronological account needs to be formalized into a sworn statement. Everything from the first time you accessed the county records through every contact you've had with the evidence. Including Crowe? Including everything. The commission needs to understand the full picture of how this investigation developed. Transparency about the process is one of the strongest things we have against a story of personal vendetta. She'd been expecting this. She'd been preparing for it, in the same way she prepared for everything, methodically, with her eyes open. The town's story about her and Crowe was already circulating, half-formed and ugly, the product of Finch's quiet work through Louise Hargrave and the bank. Putting the truth on a paper under oath was the only counter to it that would actually hold. All right, she said. The meetings happened over 3 days, in Nell's back room in the Pettis feed store, and one tense session in Calder's own kitchen when he decided he didn't want to leave his property unattended overnight anymore. Beckett was patient and precise. He asked every person the same kind of questions: what they had seen, when they had seen it, what they had done and why, what they had lost. And he listened without hurry and wrote everything down and asked them to read his summary back and confirm it and then sign. Ada Stroud's session lasted 2 hours. She talked about 16 years on the East Basin land with a specificity that made Mara's chest ache. The particular way the springs had looked in a good year, how her children had played in the creek bed that had been dry for the last 4 years, the exact date she'd signed the sale papers, and what she'd felt like driving away from the property for the last time. Beckett wrote all of it. Ada signed her name at the bottom in steady handwriting and looked at Beckett and said, "Whatever happens, I want those people to know that I know what they did. Even if nothing else comes of it, I want them to have to sit across a room from someone who knows." "They will," Beckett said. "That I can promise you." Mara's own session was the last and the longest. She started from the first winter after her father's death, when she'd begun reading his margin notes more carefully and had noticed the discrepancy in the spring output records. She went through every step, every record she'd accessed, every connection she'd drawn, every copy she'd made and where she'd kept it. She talked about the fence line meeting with Crowe, about Potts appearing at her door, about the rock through her window. She talked about walking home in the dark and feeling followed, and about standing at her table writing the date in her notebook, because she'd learned from her father that the most important thing you could do when something happened was to write it down before the memory softened. Beckett listened to all of it. He wrote. He asked clarifying questions, clean, precise, aimed at the parts that needed to be airtight. When she was done, he looked at what he'd written for a moment and then looked at her. How long were you doing this alone? He asked. 4 years, she said, more or less. Before you spoke to Crowe. Yes, he nodded slowly. That matters more than people in that commission room are going to realize at first. When they understand it, it will matter a great deal. 12 days before the commission hearing, Aldous Vane called on Ethan Crowe. Crowe told Mara about it afterward in careful detail, because he'd promised her he would. Vane had come to the ranch house in person. Not Finch, not a representative, Vane himself, which told them something about how seriously the man was now taking the situation. He was in his 60s, Crowe said, with white hair and the measured movements of someone who had learned decades ago that urgency was a weakness and that everything was a negotiation. He'd sat in Crowe's front room and been given coffee he hadn't asked for, and he'd said, with the pleasantness of a man discussing the weather, that he understood Crowe had developed some concerns about regional water rights and land transactions, and that as the region's principal land attorney, he wanted to ensure that any misunderstandings were cleared up before they became a source of unnecessary difficulty for the community. What did you say? Mara asked. I said I didn't know what he was referring to, Crowe said. He believed you? No, but he couldn't say that without showing his hand. Crowe was quiet for a moment. He said that the woman who'd been spending time at my property, he didn't use your name, was known to have some difficulties with financial stability and had a history of making claims about her father's property that had never been substantiated. He said he'd hate for me to be drawn into something uncomfortable based on unreliable information from an unreliable source. The specific phrasing of that landed in Mara's chest in a way she'd trained herself to manage. Unreliable source. Not wrong, not confused, not dishonest. Unreliable. The word designed to make her small without being specific enough to argue with. What did you tell him? I told him I appreciated his concern and that I'd be sure to evaluate all the information I received with appropriate care. He paused. He smiled when I said that. It was the smile of a man who thought he'd just been understood. Did he offer anything? Not directly, but before he left, he mentioned that several of the parcels Meridian Trust holds in the South Basin might be available for acquisition at favorable terms for a buyer with my resources. He said it almost as an aside, like it was just something that had occurred to him. She understood. Buy in. Take a piece of what we've built, make yourself a beneficiary rather than an adversary, and suddenly the inconvenient question of how it was built stops being your problem. It was elegant in its way. She would have almost admired it if she hadn't been so tired of the kind of thinking that produced it. What did you say to that? I said I'd keep it in mind. He looked at her evenly. He left satisfied. I'd rather he be satisfied and wrong than suspicious and right for as long as possible. She nodded. She thought about the 6 weeks that had been and the 12 days that remained and everything that still had to hold in place. Breckett needs to know about the visit. I'm meeting him tonight. And Calder. If Vane is making social calls on the major players, Calder's fence is probably next. Calder's wife has a brother who's staying with them, Crowe said. Started 2 days ago. Large man, used to work cattle drives. He said it without inflection. It was just a fact about Calder's domestic arrangements. Mara almost smiled. Convenient. Very, Crowe agreed. 3 days before the commission hearing, Finch made his final move. It was Louise Hargrave who delivered it. Mara didn't think Louise knew she was delivering it, which was perhaps the most depressing part. Louise stopped her on the main street in full daylight in the way that made a refusal to stop and listen into a public scene, and told her, with the particular bright concern of a woman performing care she didn't feel, that people in town were talking and she thought Mara should know. What people were saying, according to Louise, was this, that Mara Quinn had attached herself to Ethan Crowe's cause, a cause related to some dispute Crowe had with a land company over water rights, and had been representing herself as an independent investigator when in fact she was working on Crowe's behalf and had been since the beginning, that the records she claimed to have been studying for years were records she'd accessed recently, at Crowe's direction, looking for ammunition in a business dispute, that the scarf she'd given to Crowe's ranch hand had been a deliberate first approach, a way of getting access to the wealthiest rancher in the region so she could make herself useful to him and secure her own financial position. Mara stood in the street and listened to all of this. She kept her face still. She'd spent 4 years keeping her face still in Blackstone Ridge, and she was very good at it. "Thank you, Louise," she said when it was finished. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked home. She sat at her work table. She picked up her pen, wrote the date, and wrote out everything Louise had said, verbatim, as close as she could reconstruct it. Then she wrote, "This account reaches me 3 days before the commission hearing. The timing is not coincidental." She signed and dated it at the bottom and put it with the rest. Then she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She took out the scarf she'd begun when her father died and never finished. Not the one she'd given Doss, a different one she'd started for herself and had put aside when the record started demanding all her evenings. She worked on it for an hour. Her hands knew what they were doing without direction. The wool was dark blue, the same shade as the sky just before it went fully dark, and the work of it was simple and steady and asked nothing from her except attention. She thought about her father. She thought about 16 years on the East Basin land and Ada Stroud driving away for the last time. She thought about Potts in the hayloft with his coat on and Calder going up the ridge because a cut fence had made him angry enough to stop being afraid. She thought about Miles Holt still on his 300 acres, still holding, still saying no to the representatives who came to his door with their patient smiles and their certainty about what when meant. She thought about the commission room in the capital city, 3 officials sitting behind a table, and the stack of sworn statements Breckett was going to put in front of them. 14 land transactions, 11 years of records, 2 surveys of a mountain channel, the testimony of people who had lost things they'd built with their hands and their time and were willing to stand up and say so out loud in front of strangers. She worked on the scarf until the lamp needed trimming. Then she put it away, trimmed the lamp, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 3 months. The morning they left for the capital city, it was still dark. Mara had been awake before the lamp needed lighting, which told her something about the state of her nerves that she didn't particularly want to examine. She dressed in the best clothes she owned, a dark wool skirt and a jacket she'd made herself 2 winters ago, cut from fabric she'd been saving for something that warranted it. She'd never been sure what that occasion would be. Now she knew. She packed her notebook, the clean chronological account she'd prepared for Breckett, and the 2 backup copies she'd kept separate from everything else. And she stood at her work table for a moment looking at the room she'd lived and worked and thought in for 4 years. The loose board in the floor, the reglazed window with its slightly uneven glass, the shelf of her father's books with his margin notes visible on the spines. And she felt something she couldn't name exactly. Not sentimentality. More like the particular awareness that comes when you are standing at the end of one long thing and the beginning of another, and you don't know yet what the other thing will be. She locked the door behind her. Crowe's wagon was on the road already, Doss on the bench, breath coming out in visible clouds in the cold before sunrise. Breckett was inside the wagon with his case on his knees. Calder was riding alongside on his own horse. They'd arranged it so they left in 2 groups. Pettis and Ada Stroud, and Miles Holt had left the previous afternoon, separately, taking different roads to the same destination. Potts had gone the day before that, staying with a cousin in a town outside the capital, close enough to reach the hearing on time, but far enough from Blackstone Ridge that Finch would have trouble locating him quickly. Nell Fossey had offered to come. Mara had told her to stay. Someone who knew everything needed to stay in the town while they were gone, and Nell was the right person for that. She had been there before any of this started, and she would be there after. And if anything happened while they were away, she was the one person Mara trusted to manage it without losing her head. "You'll send word," Nell had said. It wasn't a question. "As soon as there's something to say," Mara had told her. She climbed into the wagon. Doss clicked to the horses. The town of Blackstone Ridge fell away behind them in the dark, and Mara sat with her notebook in her lap and watched the road come into the glow of the wagon lantern and thought about her father, and then deliberately stopped thinking about her father because she needed to be sharp today, and grief was not sharp. The capital city was 2 days' travel. They stopped overnight at a way house on the main road, a functional place with thin walls and better food than the walls suggested, and Breckett used the evening to go through the order of testimony one final time. He was methodical about it in a way that Mara found steadying, not because she hadn't already memorized the sequence, but because his calmness made the whole proceeding feel manageable rather than enormous. "The commission will have received the written statements already," he told them. "But the hearing is your opportunity to speak directly, in your own words, and to allow them to ask questions. Answer what they ask. Don't anticipate. Don't volunteer information outside your direct experience. He looked around the table at Calder and Mara, and then, through the wall essentially, at Pettis and Ada and Holt, who were at a different wayhouse down the road. If they push back on something, don't argue. State the fact again plainly and let the documentation speak. What if they've been gotten to? Calder asked. He said it the way people asked the question that had been sitting in the room unspoken, not aggressively, just directly. I've researched all 3 commissioners, Beckett said. 2 of them have no connection to Vane's network that I can find. The third is less certain, which is why the order of presentation matters. We lead with the survey evidence because it's physical and technical and the hardest to argue with. By the time we get to the testimonial accounts, the structure of what the survey shows will already be in the room. And Vane? Mara asked. Will he be there? He has the right to appear as Meridian Trust's legal representative and respond to the Commission's findings. He'll almost certainly send someone. Whether he comes himself, I don't know. Beckett looked at her steadily. If he does come, you don't speak to him. You don't look at him. You address the Commission, you answer their questions, and you trust the documentation. She nodded. She'd been telling herself the same thing for 3 days. The Commission building in the Capitol was older than she'd expected. Stone and timber, the kind of construction that had been built to last because the people who'd built it had understood that what happened inside needed to feel permanent. The hearing room was on the 2nd floor, reached by a staircase with a worn center runner that told her this space had been used a long time. 3 long windows on the south wall, and a table at the front where the commissioners would sit, and rows of chairs behind a wooden rail for the parties. They arrived early. Pettis and Ada and Holt were already there. Ada in her good dress, Holt with his hat in his hands, and his jaw set in the way Mara recognized from the stories Crowe had told her. The jaw of a man who had been told what he was worth and disagreed. Potts appeared at 5 minutes before the hour, looking pale but present, and took a seat beside Calder without speaking. Mara sat in the front row on the left side of the rail. Crowe sat beside her. He didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and that was the right choice for both of them. The commissioners entered at the hour. 3 men. 1 older, 1 middle-aged, 1 younger than she'd expected for the position, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned not to show his conclusions before he'd finished drawing them. They settled. The older one, who was apparently the chair, looked at the papers in front of him, and then at the room, and then spoke in the flat, procedural tone of a man who had run a great many of these hearings and was going to run this one with the same method regardless of what was in the room. Meridian Trust representation came in 2 minutes later, not Vane. A man named Oswald Price, who was perhaps 45, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of a lawyer who had appeared before regulatory bodies many times and knew how to make those bodies feel like they were doing him a favor by listening. He had 2 associates with him. He set his case on the table on the right side of the rail without looking at anyone on the left side. The chair began. Calder went first. He'd dressed formally, and it looked slightly wrong on him, like a man in borrowed clothes, which was the honest truth of it. He stood at the front and talked about the mountain channel in the specific technical language of someone who had surveyed it twice over 20 years and knew it the way you knew land you'd walked. Not just the facts of it, but the feel of it, the way the water moved and where it went and what happened downstream when you changed its course. He had the photographs and his field notes and his original survey documentation from 20 years prior, and Beckett entered all of it formally, and the commissioners looked at each photograph with the focused attention of men who were genuinely trying to understand what they were seeing. Price cross-examined. He was good at it. Not aggressive, which would have been the wrong approach here, but persistently questioning. He asked about the age estimation on the obstruction materials, whether it was possible for natural debris accumulation to produce similar results, whether Calder had geological training beyond surveying. Calder answered each question the way Beckett had coached all of them, plainly, without defensiveness, returning to the documented facts. The obstruction is not debris, Calder said, for the 3rd time, in response to the 3rd variation of the same question. Debris accumulates irregularly. What I documented is deliberate fill work, uniform material, introduced from outside the channel bed, placed in a pattern consistent with intentional diversion. I have surveyed channels for 23 years. I know the difference. Price moved on. The younger commissioner asked Calder 2 follow-up questions that were the sharpest questions in the room, and Calder answered them, And when he sat down, Mara could feel the shift in the air, the way the physical evidence had landed and settled and was now part of the room's understanding in a way that couldn't be unspoken. Potts went next. He was nervous in a way that was visible, his hands not quite still, but his voice was steady and his account was precise. He described the original records, the specific entries, the language of the amendments compared to what had been there before. He described the afternoon Finch had come to the records office. He stated in clear sentences that he had witnessed the original documents and could speak to the differences between them and the amended versions, and that the changes were not routine corrections but substantive alterations to the terms and parties recorded in 4 separate land transfer filings. Price objected to Potts's characterization of the amendments as substantive alterations, arguing that the determination of what constituted a substantive change was a legal question outside Potts's expertise as a records clerk. The older commissioner overruled the objection with the brevity of a man who had heard that argument before and didn't find it compelling. Price's cross-examination of Potts was harder. He pressed on Potts's relationship to the other parties. Had he been approached by Mara Quinn? Had he provided information to her before or after the amendments? Had he been offered anything in exchange? Potts answered each question truthfully and flatly, and the truth was not damaging. He had come to Mara on his own initiative after months of sitting with what he'd witnessed, motivated by what had happened to his father's land, and he had not been offered or received anything. He said that last part looking directly at Price, which was not what Beckett had told him to do, but which was, Mara thought, probably the right instinct. When Potts sat, he let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for most of the cross-examination. She touched his arm briefly, and he nodded, not trusting himself to speak quite yet. Ada Stroud spoke about 16 years on the East Basin land and the millenary that came after and the particular sound of her children asking why they couldn't go back to the creek. She was not dramatic about it. She stated facts and she stated what she'd observed about the water, and she stated what the representative from Meridian had said to her husband when they'd come to buy and what the land had sold for and what it had been worth. The middle commissioner asked her whether she had documentation of the sale terms, and she said yes, and Beckett entered the original sale agreement, which she'd kept because she was the kind of woman who kept documents because her mother had taught her that paper outlasted memory. Price's cross-examination of Ada was brief, which told Mara he'd decided she was a credible witness who wasn't worth attacking hard. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the timeline and sat back down, and the younger commissioner watched Ada return to her seat with an expression that was not exactly sympathy, but was close to something honest. Holt spoke about his 300 acres, and the 20 years he'd worked them, and the 2 representatives who'd come to his door, and the offer that had improved slightly each time, like a man who was raising his bid because he knew eventually the answer would have to change. He was blunter than the others, less polished, more plainly angry in a way that came through even when he was trying to contain it. He said, "They came to my door twice, and both times they talked about the water situation like it was weather. Like it was something that happened to the land. Nobody made that happen." He looked at the commission directly. "Somebody made that happen. I've been losing cattle for 3 years because of what somebody made happen." Price let that go without cross-examination, which was probably smart. There were moments when the aggressive strategy was to say nothing and let the anger dissipate on its own, and Price was experienced enough to know when he was in one. Then Beckett called Mara Quinn. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 3 commissioners, and did not look at Price and did not look at Crowe, though she was aware of where Crowe was, the way you were aware of something solid in your peripheral vision. She had been preparing for this moment for 4 years, though she hadn't known for most of that time that the moment was coming. She'd been preparing for it the first winter after her father died, reading his margin notes by lamplight and thinking, this is wrong and someone should say so. She'd been preparing for it every time she went to the county records office and wrote out entries in her notebook and felt the slow, methodical accumulation of documented truth that was the only tool she'd ever had. She started from the beginning, not from the scarf, not from Crowe, from her father, from George Quinn and 30 years in the valley and 18 months of illness and the land records he'd kept until his hands wouldn't hold a pen. She described the patterns she'd found in the spring output records and the sequence of land acquisitions and the specific way the timing aligned with Calder's channel documentation. She described every step she'd taken to verify what she found before she brought it to anyone else. And she described who she'd brought it to and when and why. and she described the rock through her window and the night she'd been followed, and Finch's visit to the records office and the account Louise Hargrave had delivered on the main street 3 days before this hearing. She spoke for 45 minutes. She did not rush, and she did not elaborate beyond what the documentation supported. And she answered every question the commissioners asked with the same quality her father had always called staying with the fact. Not with the surrounding feeling, not with the implication, but with the specific documented thing itself. Price cross-examined for 20 minutes. He was careful with her in a way that told her Vane had briefed him on the risk of going too hard on the wrong witness. He raised the question of her relationship to Crowe. She answered that Crowe had been a source of resources and support after she had already been investigating for 4 years, and that the chronology of her documented research predated any contact with him by a margin that was itself part of the Commission's record. He raised the question of her financial situation. She acknowledged it plainly, without apology, and noted that the Commission was free to consider whether her economic circumstances made her research unreliable, or whether they made her the least likely person to have manufactured a fraud requiring years of sustained work with no guaranteed payoff. The older commissioner made a small sound at that, which might have been anything but which Mara chose to interpret as acknowledgement. When Price asked whether it was possible she had misinterpreted the land transfer records through unfamiliarity with standard legal practice, she said, "I've been reading land records in this county for 4 years. My father read them for 30. What I found isn't a misinterpretation of legal practice. It's a pattern of 14 acquisitions, all water adjacent, all purchased from families in financial distress, all at prices below documented market value, by a company registered to an agent who also served on the county commission panel that approved the channel reroute 11 years ago. That's not a reading of the records. That's what the records say." Price had nothing further. She sat down. The room was very quiet for a moment. Crowe's shoulder was an inch from hers, and she was grateful for that inch without wanting to make anything more of it than what it was, which was the simple animal comfort of having something solid nearby. Breckett made his closing presentation for an hour. He walked through the full picture, the channel documentation, the amended records, the acquisition timeline, the commissioner connection, the testimony. He was not theatrical about it. He didn't need to be. The architecture of the thing spoke for itself, the way a well-built structure spoke for itself, and his job was to make sure the commission could see the whole shape of it and not just the individual pieces. Price responded for 40 minutes. He argued natural drought, routine correction, circumstantial interpretation, the unreliability of one woman's marginal notes as the foundation of a regulatory investigation into a legitimate land company. He was skilled. He made arguments that were not stupid, and that would have been persuasive in a room where the survey photographs and Calder's field notes, and 14 documented acquisitions, and Potts's account of the amendments, and Ada Stroud's sale agreement, and Miles Holt's blunt specific anger did not already exist. But they did exist. That was the thing about documentation. Once it was in the room, it stayed. The commissioners recessed for 2 hours. Mara sat in the corridor outside the hearing room with the others, and nobody talked much. Pettis bought coffee from a cart in the building's lobby and brought it back and handed it around without comment, which was the most useful thing anyone did in that 2 hours. Holt sat with his hat on his knee and didn't move for most of it. Potts fell asleep for 20 minutes in his chair, which was the most human thing Mara had seen anyone do in days. Crowe came and sat beside her at one point, not immediately next to her but close, and said quietly, "Whatever they decide today isn't the end of it either way. You know that." "I know," she said. "Breckett says if they rule for further investigation, Vane's office will appeal. It could be another year." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I just want to make sure you've thought about what you're going back to, in either case. The town isn't going to be easier than it was before you came here." She looked at him. "Was it easy before?" He almost smiled. "No, I suppose it wasn't." "Then it's not a new problem," she said. "It's the same problem with more people knowing about it, which is at least more honest than it was." He nodded once, slowly, and didn't say anything else, and she didn't need him to. The commission returned at mid-afternoon. The older commissioner read the findings in the same flat procedural tone he'd used to open the hearing, and Mara listened to each sentence with the specific attention of someone who has been waiting a long time and knows that how you hear something matters as much as what it says. The commission found sufficient basis in the submitted evidence to warrant a full formal investigation into Meridian Trust's acquisition practices in the Lower Basin region. The survey documentation of the mountain channel obstruction would be referred to the State Engineering Board for independent technical review. The amended county records were to be preserved in their current state pending investigation and compared against witness testimony for determination of whether alterations constituted falsification of public documents. A state investigator would be appointed to review the full acquisition history of Meridian Trust in the county, with access to all records currently or previously held by the county office. Aldous Vane's name was not in the finding. Not yet. But the channel reroute and the county commissioner approval were listed as areas the investigation would examine, and anyone in the room who knew how to read a finding could see exactly where that examination would lead. It was not a verdict. It was not a resolution. It was not the clean ending of anything. It was an opening, a formal, documented, legally binding opening that Meridian Trust and Aldous Vane could not close without the kind of action that would make everything they were trying to hide significantly more visible. Beckett turned in his chair and looked at Mara and gave a single, quiet nod. Beside her, she heard Ada Stroud exhale, a long, slow breath, the kind that carries something that has been held too tight for too long. Holt pressed his hat brim flat between his palms. Potts put his face in his hands for a moment, not in distress, but in the way people did when they needed a second without anyone looking at them. Mara sat still. She felt the moment the way she sometimes felt the end of a long sewing job. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but done in a way that was earned. The ache in her hands was real. The work had been real. What was in that commission's record now was real, and it would stay real. And that was the only kind of permanence she had ever trusted. The ride back to Blackstone Ridge took 2 days, the same as the ride out, but it felt different in the way that return journeys always felt different. The same road running in the opposite direction, the same landscape, but the weight of what you were carrying had changed. They didn't talk much in the wagon. Beckett slept for the first few hours, which he'd earned. Calder rode alongside and occasionally said something to Doss about the road conditions or the weather, the ordinary conversation of men who knew each other well enough to not need to fill silence. Mara watched the countryside and thought about the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and thinking about it was what she did when she needed to keep herself anchored to the present rather than spinning in the aftermath of something large. The investigation would take time. Beckett had said months, possibly longer. Vane's appeal, when it came, would add more time. The engineering board review of the channel would take time. All of it would take time, and none of it would be clean or fast or without moments when it seemed like the machinery was going the wrong direction. But the amended records were frozen. Meridian Trust could not now make another acquisition in the county without that acquisition coming under the scrutiny of state investigators. Miles Holt's 300 acres were not safe. The water situation wouldn't fix itself overnight. But the company that had been counting on him to run out of time could no longer be certain that its own time was unlimited. And the channel. Someone would go back to the Ridge country with the engineering board's equipment and document what Calder had documented, more formally, with the authority of the state behind it. And what had been done to the water, the deliberate, calculated, patient theft of an entire valley's future, would be part of the official record. Her father had kept notes in the margins of land records because he'd believed that true things written down were harder to unmake than true things merely known. He'd been right. He'd started something that he hadn't been able to finish, not because he wasn't sharp enough or hadn't worked hard enough, but because one person working alone in the margins of things could only get so far. You needed other people. You needed Calder with his survey camera, and Potts with his shaking hands writing out what he'd seen, and Ada Stroud keeping her sale agreement in a box somewhere, because her mother had told her to keep documents. You needed Nell Fossey and Carl Pettis and Miles Holt refusing to sell because a man he trusted had told him the water situation wasn't weather. You needed Beckett and his 3-hour sessions in lamplight, and his patient, precise belief that the truth could be assembled and presented and held up in a room where it had to be answered. And she was honest with herself about this. In a way she was less comfortable being honest about in front of other people. You needed Ethan Crowe. Not because he was wealthy, though the resources had mattered, not because he was powerful, though the protection had mattered, but because on a morning in a barn when she'd walked in with a notebook and said, "I need to tell you something," he had put down what he was doing and listened. completely, without deciding in advance what she was and what she was after and what she was worth. That had been the thing, the listening. It was a rarer quality than money, and it had mattered more. They reached Blackstone Ridge on the afternoon of the second day, coming in on the north road in the flat light of a winter afternoon, the town looking exactly as it always looked from a distance. Small and brown and wind-scoured, the kind of place that didn't advertise itself. Mara had lived here her whole life, and she still felt the particular complicated feeling of return, the one that contained both the weight of belonging to a place and the knowledge of everything that place had cost you. Nell was at the boarding house door before they'd fully stopped. She came down the steps with her coat half on and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked at Mara's face and said, "Tell me." "Investigation," Mara said. "Full formal, state level. They froze the records." Nell stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have," and stopped and pressed her lips together and didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to, and they both knew it. "I know," Mara said. Nell put both hands briefly on Mara's face, the way old women sometimes did when they were confirming that someone was real and present and still standing. Then she let go. "Come inside. It's cold, and you've been in a wagon for 2 days, and I made soup yesterday that's still good." The weeks after the hearing had their own particular quality, different from the urgency of everything before it, and different from anything Mara had expected. Word got out. She'd known it would. Blackstone Ridge was not a town that held information for long, and the hearing had involved too many people for the result to stay quiet. The way it spread through town was uneven and imperfect, the way true things always spread. Some people heard the accurate version, and some heard fragments, and some heard it first from Louise Hargrave, which meant they heard a version in which the state had agreed to look into a dispute between competing land interests, stripped of most of its meaning. But enough people heard enough of it, and what they heard was Meridian Trust was under state investigation for what it had done to the water. The town's response was complicated in the way the town's response to everything was complicated, because towns were made of people, and people were not simple, and some of them had been profiting from the situation in small ways, and some of them had been losing from it without knowing why, and some of them had known something was wrong for years, and had said nothing because saying something required a courage they hadn't been certain they possessed. Ada Stroud's shop had more customers than usual for a week. Mara wasn't sure whether that was solidarity or curiosity or just people who'd been meaning to buy a hat. It didn't particularly matter. Ada stood behind her counter with the same composure she'd had in the commission room and answered questions carefully and sent people on their way without making speeches, which was probably the right approach. Gertrude Aldis stopped her on the street and said nothing about the hearing at all, but asked with great deliberateness about Mara's sewing work, and whether she was still taking orders, which told Mara something about which way the Aldis family's wind was now blowing. She said yes, she was still taking orders, and quoted her prices, and Gertrude took note of them and went on. That was probably the most pragmatic conversation she'd had in months. Garrett Finch left Blackstone Ridge within a week of the hearing. She didn't see him go. She only knew because Doss mentioned it, in the way Doss mentioned things, flatly and without commentary. Finch's absence was its own kind of statement. Vane's office was regrouping, preparing its appeal, probably, calculating what was salvageable and what needed to be cut loose. Aldis Vane himself she did not see for 2 weeks after she returned. Then one morning she walked past his office on the way to Calloway's and he was on the step, and they looked at each other across the 10 feet of open air between them. He was composed, impeccably so, the way he'd always been. 60 years old and white-haired and possessed of the confidence of a man who had never seriously expected to be held accountable for anything he'd done. But there was something in his eyes in that brief, direct exchange that she hadn't seen there before. Not fear exactly. Something more careful than that. A recalibration. She looked at him for exactly as long as was necessary, and then she went on about her business, because she had things to do and she was not going to stand in the street performing anything for his benefit. Miles Holt got through the winter. Crowe extended his loan without discussion, the way he extended it, matter-of-factly, as if it were simply the next step in an obvious sequence. Holt didn't love taking the help, Crowe told Mara, but he took it, and he went back to his land and kept working it, and told the third Meridian representative who came to his door in February to try again in another decade. Calder's testimony before the State Engineering Board took place in early spring. He came back from it looking like a man who had been through something difficult and had not been broken by it, which was the best outcome available. The board's review would take another several months, but the technical documentation was in state hands now, outside Vane's reach. Potts kept his job at the records office through the winter, which surprised her a little. She thought about it and decided it made sense. Firing him now would look like exactly what it was. And Vane was too calculating to make that obvious a mistake while the investigation was active. Whether Potts would keep it after everything was concluded was another question, and one she didn't have an answer for. He seemed to understand that himself. He'd started studying property law in his evenings, he mentioned to her once in passing, in the way you mentioned a hedge against an uncertain future. Spring came to the valley slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, grudging at first, a few warm days followed by cold ones, the grass taking its time about deciding to grow. The water situation didn't change dramatically in that first season, and she hadn't expected it to. The channel obstruction was documented and the state engineering board was reviewing it, but the actual physical work of opening the original flow path would take planning and equipment and time. And even after it was done, a valley that had been slowly drained for 11 years would not refill in a single season. She thought about this often, in the evenings when she was sewing. Recovery was slow. That was the thing people underestimated about damage. Not the damage itself, which was usually comprehensible, but how long the healing took, and how it didn't look like healing for most of that time. It just looked like the same brown grass and the same dry creek beds, and you had to know what was happening underground to understand that something had changed. She kept her notes. She kept meeting with Beckett, who came to Blackstone Ridge once a month to update her and Crowe and whoever else needed to be in the room. She kept Potts's written account and her chronological record and all 14 documented acquisitions in the notebook under the board, not because she expected to need them again in the same way, but because the habit of keeping them had become part of how she understood herself. She was a woman who wrote things down, who kept track, who believed that true things documented were more durable than true things merely felt. She was at her work table on a March evening, working on the dark blue scarf she'd put aside months ago, when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Ethan Crowe on her step, which was unusual. He'd always sent Doss before, and she'd met him at Pettis's or the fence line. He had his hat in his hands, and he looked like he'd been thinking about something long enough that he'd decided to stop thinking and come say it instead. "I wanted to return something," he said. He held out her notebook, not her current one, but the older one, the one Beckett had taken to the Capitol, and that had gone into the Commission's record as submitted documentation. "Beckett sent it back?" "Through me. He thought you should have it in person." He paused. "He also sent a note saying the appeal has been filed and he's confident it won't hold." She took the notebook. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the familiar worn cover, the pages dense with 4 years of work in her father's handwriting and then her own. "Good," she said. He didn't leave. He stood on her step with his hat in his hands in the cold March air, and she could tell there was something else he'd come to say. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "When you first came to the barn, I said I needed a few days." He looked at his hat. "I was being careful in the way people are careful when they're not sure yet whether to trust someone. I was measuring what you knew against what I thought you might be trying to get out of it." He paused. "It took me longer than it should have to stop measuring." She thought about that. She thought about the fence line meeting and the 3 hours with Beckett in Pettis's back room and the photographs of the mountain channel and the commission hearing and all the accumulated weight of the past several months. "You stopped," she said. "That's what mattered." "It's not the same as trusting someone from the beginning." "No," she said. "It isn't. But most people don't stop at all. They measure for a while, decide it's too complicated, and go back to what they were doing." She looked at him. "You didn't do that." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a straight dealer," he said. "That's what I told you the first time we met." "Yes." "I didn't know then that you were too. I knew it by reputation, which isn't the same thing." He looked up at her. "I know it now." She felt the weight of that in a way she hadn't expected. Not sentimental, not overwhelming, but solid. The particular weight of being accurately seen by someone who had had every reason to look away. That was not a common thing in a life. You noticed it when it happened. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold and I was making tea." He came inside. He sat at her work table, the only table in the room, and she put the kettle on and they talked about the appeal and Calder's engineering board appearance and Miles Holt's spring planting for a while. And then they talked about other things, easier things, the kind of conversation that happened between people who had been through something difficult together and were now on the other side of it and finding out what they were to each other in the ordinary light of a regular evening. It was not smooth. They disagreed about two things and talked around a third. And there was a moment when she said something that came out wrong and had to be restated, which was how real conversations went. She liked that. The wrongness of it and the restating. The fact that nothing about the evening was performing itself. There is a particular kind of justice that doesn't arrive in a single moment. It doesn't come as a verdict read in a clean room with everyone watching. It comes slowly, in increments, through channels that are tedious and imperfect and take longer than anyone wants them to take. It comes because someone kept a notebook, because someone else surveyed a channel and wrote down what he saw, because a young records clerk stayed in the building when he should have gone home, and an old woman in a boarding house knew which thread to pull, and a man on a ranch decided to put down the harness and listen. Aldous Vane's appeal was denied 4 months after it was filed. The investigation that followed was the longest Breckett had ever worked. 14 months, 3 commissioners, 2 hearings, a technical report from the State Engineering Board that ran to 90 pages and concluded without ambiguity that the mountain channel obstruction was deliberate and had resulted in quantifiable harm to the lower basin water supply. Meridian Trust was found to have engaged in a pattern of predatory acquisition tied to manufactured scarcity. The company was ordered to divest 16 of its valley parcels, to pay restitution to 11 of the families who had sold under duress, and to fund the engineering work required to restore the original channel. Aldous Vane was censured by the state bar and removed from his position as county commissioner agent. He did not go to prison. The case for criminal fraud was built, but the bar for criminal conviction was high, and the commission worked within civil channels. That was the imperfection in it. That was the thing Mara lived with, the part that didn't resolve cleanly. The man who had engineered the slow drowning of a valley was censured and disbarred and professionally destroyed, and he still walked through the world, and some part of her had to accept that this was what accountability looked like in the real and imperfect operation of law and evidence and process. She accepted it. Not easily, not without anger, but honestly. She'd learned from 4 years of reading records that the alternative to imperfect accountability was no accountability at all, and she was not willing to let the perfect be the reason the achievable was abandoned. Ada Stroud's family did not get their East Basin land back. The restitution was money, which was real and mattered, but it was not the same as the land, and Ada knew that and said so plainly, and then used the money to buy a parcel on the North Road that was smaller than what she'd lost, but was hers, with clean water access, and she planted a kitchen garden that first spring. Her husband, who had been cautious all the way through, cried when the papers were signed. Ada did not. She got a shovel and started turning the soil. Miles Holt kept his 300 acres. The water returned to his West Basin land slowly. The engineering work on the channel took 18 months from the order to the completion, and the refilling of the aquifer took longer than that. But by the second year after the restoration, his spring grass was noticeably better. He paid back Crowe's loan in full, in cash, and brought a jar of preserved plums along with the money, which Crowe apparently had no idea what to do with but accepted graciously. Holt told Mara about it afterward with the particular pleasure of a man who had kept his land and paid his debts, and had strong feelings about both of those things being true at once. Potts left the records office eventually, not fired, but resigned, which was its own kind of statement about the difference between staying somewhere because you had no choice and leaving because you decided what you were worth. He went to Harlan County, studied properly, and eventually worked as a land records consultant for the very kind of commission that had heard Mara's evidence. She thought her father would have found that satisfying in a dry and specific way. Theo Calder retired from surveying 2 years after the hearing. He framed the engineering board's 90-page report. Not the whole thing, just the cover page which bore his name as the originating surveyor, and put it on the wall of his house, next to a photograph of the mountain channel taken before and after the restoration work. He didn't make a speech about it. He just put it on the wall. Mara Quinn finished the dark blue scarf in April of that first spring after the hearing. She wore it that winter, and the winter after that, and it was still good wool, and the work was still solid, and on the mornings when she walked through Blackstone Ridge with it. Around her neck, she thought about the 11 days it had taken to make the other one and the strange and unlikely chain of events that had begun with a simple thank you. She did not believe everything happened for a reason. She had read too many records, seen too many families lose too much to chance and cruelty and the patient greed of people who'd never had to account for it, to believe that the world arranged itself with that kind of intention. But she believed that what you did with what happened to you was its own kind of authorship. That you could write your own margin notes in the edges of the story someone else was trying to tell about your life. That those notes, kept carefully and honestly, and over time, could become more durable than the story they'd been written in response to. Her father had taught her that. Not in so many words. In notebooks. She kept his on the shelf. She kept hers underneath. She started a new one in the spring because there was always more to document, and because the habit of accuracy was the most useful thing she knew, and because the valley was slowly refilling and someone ought to be keeping track of that too.